Okay, so we're gonna get started. Welcome to the panel 13, What the Film Teaches Us About Anti-Blackness in the US. I am Araceli Esparza, an associate professor in the English department at Cal State Long Beach, and I will be serving as moderator for the panel. This is the opening panel for CSULB's Scholar Strike events, Speaking Out, Supporting Anti-Racism at CSULB and beyond. We look forward to discussing and contextualizing Ava DuVernay's documentary 13 with all of you. We hope you will be able to participate in our other panels and events, which you can find more information about in the link we will be posting in the chat in a moment. We want to begin with the acknowledgement that we are on Indigenous land. CSULB is located on the ancestral site of Pavona. We are on the land of the Tongva Gabrieleño and the Ahachaman Juaneño nations who have lived and continue to live here. We recognize that the Tongva and Ahachaman nations and their spiritual connections as the first stewards and the traditional caretakers of this land. Many people participated in planning CSULB's Scholar Strike events. First, I want to take a moment to recognize Dr. Anthea Butler, an associate professor of religious and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania, who on Wednesday, August 26, introduced the idea for what became the Scholar Strike with a tweet which read, "I would be down as a professor to follow the NBA and strike for a few days to protest police violence in America." Soon after, her co-organizer, Kevin Gannon, a professor of history at Grandview University, joined her to start planning a national scholar strike in order to take collective action against police violence and in support of community organizing for racial justice. Responding to this call, faculty at CSULB collaborated to organize this series of events. While over 30 faculty members took part in organizing CSULB's Scholar Strike events, I want to specifically recognize the tireless efforts of Kimberly Walters, assistant professor in the Department of International Relations. Kudos to Kim for overseeing our efforts and keeping us all remarkably organized. I also want to thank Lily House-Peters for her behind-the-scenes assistance on this panel. Additionally, I wish to recognize the support we received from President Connolly's office, President Jersky, Malcolm Finney, Director of the Faculty Center, CFA Long Beach, and Academic Technology Services. As part of the series of events we have organized over the next 2 days, we encourage you to participate in some of the direct actions listed on our website and linked in the chat. One action you can take today is to fill out your census. Approximately 40% of households currently remain uncounted, and we must all do our part to make sure everyone is counted, since the census determines the number of political representatives, the boundaries of congressional, state, local, congressional, state, and local districts, in addition to the allocation of funds to federal, state, and local governments for services such as education, housing, food and health programs, and emergency services. You can also register to vote, get others to register, and check your voter status at vote.gov. The final action I will mention is a march to end police violence taking place today at 3 p.m. at Recreation Park in Long Beach on 7th Street. Now we will turn our attention to the panel and discussion you are all here for, which is focused on Ava DuVernay's 2016 documentary 13. 13th traces the roots of mass incarceration to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, prompting viewers to consider the ongoing legacies of slavery and the criminalization and dehumanization of Black people in the US. We have 3 panelists today to help us frame this discussion. Our first speaker is Dr. Keith Claybrook Jr., who is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at CSULB, where he teaches classes on history and the social sciences. He is co-advisor of the Africana Studies Students Association and the Black Student Union. Professor Claybrook completed his PhD in Cultural Studies with a certificate in Africana Studies from Claremont Graduate University in 2016. In his work, he argues that student activism is an intellectually and academically relevant activity, linking concepts learned in the classroom to the real world. His publications include David L. Horn, a living example of a Pan-African leader, scholar, activist, Black Power and Black Students and the Institutionalizing of Change, Loyola Marymount University, 1968 to 1978. The title for his remarks today is 13th, and the continued need for the Black freedom struggle. Our next panelist is Dr. Kelly Sharon, who is a lecturer in the Departments of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Sociology at CSULB. Professor Sharon completed her PhD in Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona in 2019. Her current project, The Caring State, The Politics of Contradiction in Ferguson, Missouri, considers the multiple state tactics at play in police brutality, including the extension of a feminist ethic of care and producing violent effects. The title for her remarks today is What is the State Without State Violence? Our final speaker will be Dale Landrum, who is a formerly incarcerated person and is now a doctoral candidate in educational leadership at CSULB. He is a co-founder of CSULB Rising Scholars, the former interim director of Project Rebound at the Beach, and recently took a position with the Prison Education Project, teaching in a California prison at which he served time twice. Before entering higher education in 2009, Dale spent 28 years ensnared in the criminal justice system. He has been jailed 24 times, imprisoned 6, and holds 2 strikes in the state of California. His remarks today are titled Behind the Walls, Beyond the Bars. After our panelists give their prepared remarks, we will have a question and answer period, and audience members can use the Q&A option to post their questions throughout the panel. Without further delay, we will now go to our first panelist, Dr. Claybrook.
Great, thank you. Can you remind me real quick how much time we have?
7 to 10 minutes.
Okay, great, thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here and be part of this conversation. I'd be remiss if I did not mention Dr. Anthea Butler. She's actually one of my instructors when I was an undergraduate at Loyola Marymount. So it's good to see that she's still active and involved in doing a lot of the things that she encouraged us to do all those, many years ago when I was her student as well. Talking about 13th is always difficult for me to deal with some of these sorts of issues because I'm born in the 70s, grow up as a kid in the 80s, come of age in the 90s. And so the chunk, a major chunk of the documentary is, I lived through, is my lived experience. I'm born and raised in Compton. And so being born and raised in Compton, coming up in the 80s and 90s, I am not unaware of many of the things that were discussed in the documentary. Some of the other things I become aware of as I get older, as I go into college and then for my own studies and what have you. But for me, this is not a academic and intellectual enterprise. This is very personal to me, with the family members who are very much so embedded in almost every aspect of this documentary. This is not an intellectual and academic enterprise for me. This is personal. So I ride a line between being a teacher scholar in this moment and being a man, being a Black man from Compton, growing up in the midst of the war on drugs, growing up in the midst of gang violence, growing up in much of what we like in the Reagan Bush Quayle, era, all these sorts of things. This is not, it's difficult for me to parcel out the things that I know and understand scholarly with the things that I know and understand experientially and the things that I know and understand personally. So I can watch 13th. Very good documentary. I enjoyed it. I thought it was very well done, but I believe that it was not for me. What I mean by that is there was nothing in the documentary that was novel. That's not to say that it wasn't important. What I mean by that is a lot of the things that were shared and that were discussed in there in the documentary were things that many of the kids that I grew up and many of the folks who were a few years older than me, we knew this stuff. We may not have had all of the details, all of the context to be able to explain it in an articulate way, in 1987 or in 1993, but we understood what was going on. And so now scholarizing, intellectualizing the things that I lived through evokes a different type of emotion because I'm a parent now of 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. I love my children, but from birth, even before my children were born, it's always in the back of my mind. I know what it means when they are born, because if it's a boy, I know what it means to be a Black male in America. I know what's ahead. And so how do I raise this child with to be mindful and prepared for what's to come without infusing my own pain and my own hurt from my experiences with law enforcement into theirs, because they need to have their own experiences, not clouded by the experiences that I myself had. My first run-in with the police is at 11 years old. For those of you who are familiar with Compton, I grew up on the west side, on right off of Rosecrans and Central. I could literally walk to Taco Bell that's on the corner, hop the back fence, walk right to Taco Bell, and I could not get from, basically it's like a quarter mile. Could not walk there, didn't get halfway there before I'm initially stopped by the police, just walking with $2.50 or whatever it was, trying to get a burrito and some nachos from Taco Bell without a cop stopping me and saying, "What are you doing? Where are you going? Stay out of trouble," these sorts of things. There was a lot of emotion. I remember when this film came out, but I did not watch it initially, but I did watch it later. And then I watched it again in preparation for today. And a lot of those feelings, that hurt, that anger, that frustration, not against any individual police officer, but the feeling is the same in my 40s as it was as a teenager. If I see a police officer behind me, is this the time that I'm not going to go back home? That fear still resonates with me. My son, who's 15, he'll be 16 in a few months. I love my son. I'll take him and do all these different sorts of things. There's fear when I drive with my son in the car, because from the back, you don't know he's 15. And then he's 15 years old, but people still see and they question, they assume that he's an adult. But he's 15, he's still a kid, and so I understand what my presence means when people see me. I'm 6 foot, 200-pound Black man with an afro from Compton. I still live in Compton. I finished school and moved back to Compton. I have no problems with Compton. I love Compton. It's my home. My children are born and raised in Compton, but I'm not unaware of what that means. So there's a lot of personal attachment there, but I bring those experiences to my studies. And it's interesting, as a student and as an instructor, one of the things that is commonly asked from many students and then also just from other people in general, why do Black people always bring up race? Everything's race, 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 race. Why you guys keep on bringing up race? One of the things that I appreciated about 13th was it demonstrated the centrality of race in the Black experience. So I largely do not talk about social justice. I talk about racial justice. I talk about racial justice because as a Black man in America who was given, had a Black woman give birth to him, who has 2 Black women who are as his sisters, married a Black woman, 2, Black female daughters. race is central to all of our experiences to varying degrees and understood differently. But one of the things that I try to bring to the table when we talk about race as a social construct is that if race is a social construct, then what is the raw materials that construct race? It's not enough to say, oh, it's ignorance. Oh, it's people who are full of hate. If anything is constructed, whether it's a building or a cake, something had to go into constructing it. So I challenge my students and I challenge all of us to do some digging into what are the raw materials, if you will, that goes into the construction of race, because there's no addressing race without understanding those raw materials. It's also difficult to deal with this thing called race because race continues to center white people. Race, and by extension, is created to, with racism, which is a hierarchy of a racial hierarchy, racism. So you cannot have a conversation about race without censoring white people. So a conversation about racial justice is a conversation not about Black people, because many of the things that are discussed in the film are things that we already know and live. The issue is, what about white people? Not just the ones who run down protesters and fly Confederate flags. Even some of our allies understanding what it means to be white in America, even as an ally. And I will end with this, because I know I'm at 10 minutes. I'm gonna end with this, is that we're in California and we know that AB 1460 was just passed. And we're talking about racial justice. We're talking about ethnic studies, but after 50 years, still struggling to get ethnic studies in general, Africana studies more specifically, as part of the GE package. However, we will draw upon people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Ibram Kendi, Michelle Alexander, Yaba Blay, and yes, Anthea Butler, who were all either teaching in or have degrees in Africana studies. Because this is not an intellectual exercise for us. To a large degree, it's life or death. It's not an over-exaggeration when I say that Africana studies as an undergraduate saved my life. And as an adult, made sense of the nonsense that I was experiencing in my youth and continue to experience in my adulthood. So I will pause there, and I look forward to our conversation, to our dialogue at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now go to Dr. Sharon.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the organizers, to CFA, and the administration for their work to put this together quickly and for offering support for this vital programming. My hope is that this conversation is the first of many, and that anti-racist feminist work continues to be prioritized moving forward. My title and these opening remarks seek to explore the relationship of the state to its various apparatuses of violence, from the police to the prison, to bail, to immigration enforcement, a nexus usefully termed the prison industrial complex. I see the work of the 13th as indebted to exploring this relationship, both in space and time. The 13th explains how we've arrived at the age of mass incarceration, where in the US imprisons 25% of the incarcerated population in the world, and 1 in 3 Black men are confined behind bars. This history is one of the mutually enforcing relationship between capitalism and anti-Black violence, or what is called racial capitalism. In the present, the 13th extends the work of incarceration beyond the prison itself, to explore the ways that identity and relationships are shaped by long-standing representations, technologies, political processes, and internalized racism. I see the 13th as a reminder, a history lesson, as well as a call to action. It looks backward to the statecraft of the 13th Amendment, which brings into existence the modern police, to hold fast to an economy dependent upon free labor, while simultaneously looking forward and anxiously anticipating the new forms of state violence yet to come. I want to work through these moments, the past and the future, through a feminist critique of the state. The short answer to my title, Is There a State Without State Violence?, is no, or at least not yet to come in the American context. Slavery and colonization are the country's original sins that have not yet been reckoned. The 13th illustrates the ways in which the promises of freedom have fallen short, as slavery has been transformed into criminalization. Both processes serve the same cause: the accumulation of resources and power for white people and white men specifically. A feminist critique of the state and the criminal justice system speaks both broadly and specifically to the ways that the state injures, incapacitates, and kills. Feminist critique names specifically the sources and sites of oppression, while also providing the roadmap to proceed through histories of abolitionist struggle. The interwoven histories and constitutions of race and gender demonstrate the ways that they are predicated on each other. The scene in Birth of a Nation, depicted in the 13th, demonstrates so clearly the stakes of white femininity and Black masculinity, that one's frailty is based on another's trespass, and that Black femininity is withdrawn, unknowable, and constituted through tropes alone, while white masculinity is the absent center that holds and polices the boundaries of race and gender. A feminist lens makes these histories evident, while also precisely diagnosing the injustices of the justice system. Just as Angela Davis puts the court on trial and walks free, she and others continue the work of feminist organizing, the refusal to play by the rules, accept the pittance, and show respect to a murderous system. Instead, a feminist analysis insists on resistance on multiple and sometimes contradictory scales, constant and unrepenting attention to difference, and a guiding ethic of ending oppression. The history lesson of the 13th illustrates an important tension, that a country predicated on freedom and liberty was only made possible through slavery. This is the entanglement of the state and capitalism. At the beckoning of free markets, there's a simultaneous suppression of labor and the acceleration of the slave trade. Free markets perversely require people in chains. Marx describes this paradox as the double bind of freedom, that workers are free to sell their labor and that labor is their only means of exchange. With what Saidiya Hartman calls a dark humor, Marx describes freedom under capitalism as, quote, free in the double sense. That as a free man, he can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity, and that on the other hand, he has no commodity for sale, is short of everything necessary for the realization of his labor power, end quote. Capitalism requires a working class for whom labor is their only commodity and who must continually, freely exchange that labor in order to subsist. Hartman reminds us of the ways that slavery is integral to the development of early capitalism in the United States, and that slave labor creates the wealth that makes possible American leadership today. Slavery is omnipresent in today's society. We live in the wake of its diaspora. Unless we think the moment has passed, the 13th reminds us not only of its shifting forms, but also the ongoing accumulation of capital at the expense of labor. The 13th insists on the connections between racial violence and economic violence, and it is vital to point to the moments in which this is deeply inflected throughout time, both in anti-Black as well as anti-Latinx and xenophobic forms. The wealth disparities of our time are only made possible through racist action. There's no white 1% without the Black incarcerated 40.2%. The 13th Amendment acknowledges and anticipates this need, laying the foundation for the accelerationist tough on crime politics of the last 50 years, including the war on drugs and the 1994 crime bill. We must always be clear and precise. Freedom depends on unfreedom. Capitalism depends on free labor, and law and order is always a veiled threat. The ideology of the prison exceeds its walls. We live in its shadow. Freedom and wealth depend on their own specter. The 13th issues a steady caution throughout. Simply put, we haven't heeded these histories in the past, haven't repaired the foundational logics of inequality, and continue to consciously or unconsciously participate in race-baiting politics. The veil of colorblindness facilitated by neoliberalism and the false sense of progress agitates the political body. We were a gaslit society from which Trump and his success awakened us. Various interviews throughout the 13th remark on this anxiety and promote a state of hypervigilance. Van Jones says, "We don't know what it will be, but it will be." There's a promise of, quote, "new permutations of a cancer," end quote. There's a need to name the next phase and prepare for the onslaught of state violence yet to come. It is not lost that we are here on a webinar and not in a room together, that our social mobilizations are as much virtual as they are in the street, that the transmission of information is as vital as sitting in. We meet today as there's an ongoing pandemic, one that disproportionately affects people of color and poor people in the United States. The conditions of COVID-19 have divided the social body into those that are constantly at risk of exposure and those that are safer at home. That this fracture is on the fault lines of race and capital is no coincidence. Our relationship to capitalism is literally making us sick. George Floyd, an unwilling martyr, represents the colliding risks of slow and fast death that define Blackness in the United States, one at the hands of the pandemic and the other at the hands of the police. We are in the midst of a new permutation, and the demands for economic justice, safety, and shelter are calls for an anti-racist politics. The uprising against the police in 2020 cannot exist without widespread unemployment. As the 13th urges, we must constantly be attentive to anti-Black racism, as it is foundational to our politics and creeps into our rhetoric. Following a feminist critique, we must not only diagnose, but act, to seize the moment and the energy and imagine otherwise. In my case, it's a state without violence, a world without police, and an economy without property. While it may not yet exist, there is a feminist blueprint forward. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now go to our final speaker, Del Lendron.
Hello, everybody. My remarks are entitled Behind the Walls, Beyond the Bars. But first, I am both humbled and honored to be asked to share this space with all of you and to offer my thoughts on this powerful documentary. I think it's important to say that while I cannot and will not speak personally on what it's like to be a person of color experiencing the things that I have experienced, I can speak as someone who knows what it's like to be the property of the state, thrust into involuntary servitude and exploited for my labor by a system designed to keep folks down. But more importantly, I can speak as someone who has witnessed the unspeakable treatment of folks of color behind the walls and beyond the bars for 4 decades. My comments are really brief. My dissertation focuses upon the experiences of formerly incarcerated females in California's community colleges using the lenses of intersectionality born of Black feminist thought and transformative learning. Since 1980, women have been incarcerated at twice the rate of that of men, and at 8 times the rate they were 4 decades ago. When one considers that roughly 80% of incarcerated women are mothers, more than 50% are the custodial parent of a minor child, and a child of an incarcerated parent is more likely to drop out of school, engage in delinquency, and contribute to generational cycles of incarceration, it's easy to see how the criminal justice system is designed to feed itself, generation after generation. And in many ways, for me, this is symbolic of breeding enslaved women to keep the prison plantation full of enslaved bodies. Again, thank you for inviting me to share this space with you, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Thank you, Keith, Kelly, and Dale for your remarks on 13th. And at this point, we're going to open the floor to Q&A. Let's see. If any of you have questions that you want to put in the Q&A box, I guess, screen. The Q&A is only typed, so we will not be unmuting participants or attendees. But we do have the chat feature. You should put your questions in the Q&A box though. We have one question. Melanie Bukowski wants to know if anyone will be posting their lecture, a copy of their lecture, particularly Kelly. They want to know. They want to use some of what you shared in their class, in the space of their classroom.
Yeah, I am absolutely happy to. I think Dr. Lilyhouse Peters has mentioned that she can facilitate posting them on the website.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Claybrook, there's a question for you. Would you please go deeper into the ingredients of racism? I also saw a few people in the chat were really interested in that concept you brought to the table. So can you please talk more about the ingredients of racism?
Sure, no problem. You know, clearly I can't go into it the way I go into the classroom, but I'll give you the quick short version. So as I said, you know, anything that we construct, right, whether it's a house, a car, a cake, what have you, something has to go into it to construct it, right? So what are the raw materials to bring in to bear about the social construction of race? I'm not prioritizing, so I'm gonna go through a list. For our purposes here, I'll just talk about 4, maybe 5 things real quickly. And it's not to prioritize the list in the order because all of them work in unison to create this thing that we call race. First, it's the religious construction of race. And again, this is not to say that religion in and of itself or Judeo-Christian Islamic, you know, beliefs are racist in and of themselves, but I am saying that if we take a look at, let's say, just 2 quick stories out of the Old Testament, out of Genesis, the story of Cain and Abel. After Cain kills his brother, and God punishes him, he says to have bestowed a mark, but it never says black, it doesn't say slavery, it doesn't say African or anything like that. But years later in the 14th, 15th centuries, we begin to see that that mark begins to be recognized and assumed to be black. You look at the story of Ham, right, or the so-called curse of Ham, right? It doesn't say that Ham's descendants or the Canaanites, right, would be black, but it does say that they'd be cursed and would be the servants, you know, of their brethren, and so it was understood later that must have meant that it was black people. So the curse of Ham has largely been used to justify the enslavement of African people. Then the other ingredient that goes into constructing race, if you will, is the role of science and attempts at classifying classifying humanity and understanding the racial classifications. And we ultimately kind of wind up at Darwin, all right? Then so now you have, you know, the racial, the religious dynamic, and then the science dynamic, both trying to explain the unexplainable. Then briefly, you can't leave it there. It has to be institutionalized. It has to be formalized. It has to be given teeth, if you will. So how do you enact that? How do you institutionalize it? That's where the role of the law and the role of economics comes in. So even from the early years of, when the United States is still a British colony, we begin to see the policing of race, right? We see the policing of race by ensuring or instituting anti-miscegenation laws, right? By policing what it means to be a citizen based on race. And then economics as well, who can own property, who cannot own property. A lot of these things was also done by race. And I can go into more, of these, but this is just like a little introduction, let's say the social constructions of race. So anything that's been socially constructed, we have to take a look at what are the ingredients, if you will, what are the raw materials that go into the construction. And so that's just a brief introduction to some of that. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for that brief introduction to racial formation. Griselda Suarez has a question. The film, she writes, the film did provide some background information about the detention centers for immigrant families. Can any of the panelists further discuss how the prison complex is involved in this government action? And that's an open question to any of the panelists.
Yeah, I can take that. When you look at the 13th and discussion about ALEC and privatized for-profit prisons and how contractually it was required that they be kept at a certain percentage of capacity to keep the contracts valid with the states or the federal prison system. In the last, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, 9 years ago, there was a lot of challenge to these for-profit private prisons, and they began to be phased out, so to speak. Fewer and fewer states were contracting with, and contracting fewer and fewer private prisons, if you will. Then the current administration came along and began to cage, if you will, immigrant families. And these for-profit private prisons found new life. And so this administration brought them back to life. And ironically enough, one of the for-profit private prisons I served time in had actually been closed, but reopened over a decade later to begin housing immigrant families and folks like that. So something that was close to going away has been brought back to life for just nefarious reasons by a nefarious administration, in my opinion. And we need to make collective efforts to shut these prisons down again, because they profit from incarcerated bodies. And they demand in their contracts that the capacity is as high as possible. So, my thoughts
there. Keith or Kelly, do you want to add anything? Okay, this next question is for Kelly. Dr. Sharon, on what level must we start, national, regional, et cetera, in America for moving away from a capitalist system?
Just a small question. I think, and what I was trying to point to in sort of thinking about feminist critique is that it's not an either or about levels, right? That it has to be a constant attention to dismantling these systems on all levels, right? That there has to be a different sort of personal ethic about how you view your labor and your time. There also has to be a different ethic about how you view your community and the people you're in relationships with. But beyond that, we of course need to push for national change. Even something like a way more progressive income tax is moving away from capitalism, right? So it's not that we have to wholesale get rid of it, but rather change the way we think about our relationship to property while also pushing for larger scale legislative change. So the answer is all of the levels at the same time. And that's really the only sort of way I see negotiating our relationship to capitalism. And to be mindful that any step forward is a step forward, and that we can always slowly sort of step back from the age of hyper-capitalism, hyper-exploitation, hyper-neoliberalism, hyper-wealth disparities that we've entered into at this point. It's not inevitable.
Thank you. I'm gonna sort of link two questions here. Laura Wilson Mao writes, there may be many students here who don't know about AB 1460. Dr. Kleber, can you speak more to how your studies, quote, made sense of the nonsense, end quote, you experience, and why it would be of value to our students to study these subjects? And then a related question, or a question that I see as related in the chat from Willow Holmes. Do any of the panelists have advice for us students to fight racism within our daily lives and the structures we are a part of in society? So since Keith does work on the ways in which education is linked to social change, I think, I'm thinking about these questions as related. So maybe Keith, you can start, and if Kelly or Dale have anything to add, we can jump in.
Yes, thank you. Can you repeat the first part of that again? It was breaking up on my end. I just had to change a couple of things, my internet connection.
Yeah. And this brave new world, right? of relying on the internet.
Right.
It's asking you to say more about AB 1460, how you made sense of nonsense in your experience, and how why it would be of value for students to study these subject areas. And then the question that I'm linking it to is how students can fight racism within their daily lives and the structures we are a part of in society. So I see them as related because there's this focus on the relationship between education and activism and social change.
Right, right. Yeah. Okay, so that's a lot there to try to briefly respond to, but I'll do my best. Let me start with the making sense of the nonsense. Making sense of the nonsense essentially is being courageous enough to ask critical questions. We cannot be afraid to ask questions. We cannot be afraid to ask questions. I'll say it again. We cannot be afraid to ask questions. One of the things that happens, especially in K through 12 in this era that we're living in, is our students, our young people are being not educated, but being trained to take a test at the end of the school year. And I'll jokingly say with my students that, remember the textbook that you had to answer the questions at the end of the chapter, and at the end of the, you answer those questions, but many of our teachers would skip the critical thinking question. And they would always kind of like joke like, yeah, they did skip the critical thinking question, right? We can't be afraid to ask questions. We have to think critically. And when we see issues, we have to begin to address it. And we can't be afraid to address it. I think one of the, talking about fear. Fear can stop us or propel us. And fear is very real, but fear is also a natural human emotion. And so we should never apologize for being afraid. But it's what we choose to do with that fear. And so if we study history, we see, if I look at the 60s for a moment, we see people who were afraid, and many of these, we take a look at a lot of those images of folks, who are marching down the street or getting into it with the police, students who are taking over buildings, and many of them were afraid. They did not know what was going to happen next, right? There was no formula of what will happen with a prescripted end in sight. But the fear of not doing anything was scarier. So they had to make moves. And much of it was learning along the way. And so this is the argument that I make in much of my work, is that activism in and of itself is both an intellectual and an academic enterprise. So when you engage in activism, when you are going to learn. if you're going to, as people say, speak truth to power, you have to do your homework beforehand. You can't just go in there, you know, and I mean, you can go out into the streets and raise your fist in the air and shout obscenities at whoever's listening, but that's not where the work is going to be done. The work is going to be done behind the scenes. And so when you go do the work behind the scenes, in the boardroom, wherever that takes place, you have to come in already with your homework, so to speak, already being done. And so you also are learning how systems work, how processes work, what part of the process can be skipped and go to the next part, or which part of the process is actually cancerous, so that you can remove the cancer and have a process that is disease free, right? And so again, in that activism itself, you begin to learn and understand. You can study a lot of these things. You can read them in a book, and I encourage people to read. I encourage people to study. But it's one thing for us to understand this in the abstract. It's another thing for us to take it from the library, to take it from the comforts of our homes, you know, with our books in front of us, and try to put it into action, right? The link between theory and praxis there. That is where much of the real learning and education, you know, takes place. And so that's part of the power of AB 1460, I believe, because AB 1460 has made ethnic studies a requirement for graduation in the CSU. It's not adding on an additional 3 units, it's the existing 120 minimum, right? But now part of that is at least 3 units of those being taken in ethnic studies. And for 50 plus years now, it is those scholars, as I mentioned earlier, like a Kimberly Crenshaw, Ibram Kendi, Michelle Alexander, Yaba Blay, Anthea Butler, even right here on our campus, Maulana Karenga and others, right, who have championed this call for not only social justice, but also for racial justice, and has taken that to the classroom, has put that in their scholarship, but has also, to varying degrees, you know, into their communities at large, advocating for social responsibility and civic change, right? In an effort to produce change agents who can go out into the world in their respective careers and be and impact, positively impact curriculum, legislation, and other laws and processes. So that was a lot there to try to unpack. I hope that made sense, to try to bring all of that, you know, to some sort of answer that is coherent, right? With so much there to try to unpack.
Thank you, Keith. Kelly or Dale, do you want to add anything to the question of student activism and ethnic studies?
I just want to add briefly, and this piggybacks off of Keith's comments a little bit. What I see is so important and valuable about AB 1460 is the specificity and attention to race, right? That it's not talking about these things in sort of vague terms, but rather really contending with racial histories, racial formations, and then how we can sort of begin to think about social change or education as a pathway to radicalization and liberation. And so I think that's what's so critical about this curriculum, is that it remains specific and it remains attentive to race first and foremost.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about policing. And attendees are asking us to, or asking you all to talk about the relationship between policing and mass incarceration, the call for defending the police as and the link to to mass incarceration. And in particular, one participant is asking you to talk about the policing of Black women specifically, and how that's linked to questions of mass incarceration. So those are, I'm bridging multiple questions. And if any of our panelists have something to say about that relationship between policing and mass incarceration, there's interest.
Policing and mass incarceration. So it's important for us to understand kind of in part, this whole idea of policing is nothing new. You know, when enslaved Africans would liberate themselves, I don't say running away, made it sound like they did something wrong, like they weren't supposed to free themselves from that sort of captivity. No, they didn't run away. They were attempting to liberate themselves, to free themselves from an abusive system. They were brought back by people that were referred to as slave catchers, right? But again, this is policing. This is policing in the sense of policing what freedom means. Policing what freedom means, and policing who has access to that freedom. When you take a look at the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, as the film referenced, outlaws all forms of involuntary servitude except for those that's convicted of a crime. And then you go into look at different, vagrancy laws and, things of that nature. One of the things that we have to look at is what we talk about policing, where, as well as race, it's the questions of power relationships, and power dynamics. Who has power? Who doesn't have power? Who's trying to maintain power? And who's trying to increase their power? Notice I did not say they were powerless. All people have power, but to increase that power to make systemic change, that's a different sort of conversation. So policing then, when people start talking about police, I kind of think about police, and then I'm gonna get back to a little bit more meaty part of it. Think about police. I know some police officers, I'm not saying all police officers are bad or anything like that, but what I am saying is this. When I go hiking or I go camping, I'm not going to pause and say, well, all snakes aren't venomous. Let me go and see if this is the one that is. I'm going to take caution immediately, given the history of snake bites, venom, death. Given the experiences of Black people in this country, other people as well, but Black people in particular that I'm referring to right now, policing has created fear and anger. Fear and anger. So when you take a look at, as the film articulates, many of the civil unrest, I don't refer to them as riots. Riots suggesting like it's a disturbance of the peace, a melee. No. If you were Black in an urban area in the 60s, the peace had already been disturbed. There was no peace. No, these were rebellions. These were uprisings, right? But many of them are in response to police abuses of power. So the issue in and of itself, is it police? I don't know how much of it is police as it is a police misuse of power. And so some of that has to do with policies that are in place. Some of that has to do with training that is in place. But a lot of it has to do with holding police accountable for inaction as well as action, right? So at some point, we have to start taking a look at why, historically speaking, have police not been brought to justice to pay for their crimes when they themselves are wearing badges? Why police themselves have not been brought to justice when they have abused other people when they weren't wearing their badges at that moment? So we could talk about policy, we could talk about training. I'm interested in another aspect of the conversation is, when are they going, the so-called bad apples, if you will. I'm going back, remember, I started off this conversation very personal. I remember watching TV and they broke in to the scheduled program showing the 4 officers accused, who beat Rodney King. I remember that like it happened yesterday. And we would jokingly say at the time, Stevie Wonder could see they're guilty. Like we would say these things, right? But then a year later, they're acquitted. So now what message did that send to a 12, 13, 14-year-old Black boy? It sends the message that police can do these things without being brought to justice. So even though NWA made their songs years earlier, Ice-T made his song a couple years prior to that, and I can go down the list of things that are where we were shouting what was going on. Then here you have it, the video, and they still get off. This is not about Rodney King, so stop calling it the Rodney King riot. This was about those 4 police officers being acquitted for violating this man's rights, regardless of whatever crime he was accused of. And I can go down a list of other folks, right, who have other situations. No one deserved that, right? So this is about about being brought to justice. And so I think that one of the things that we can do as civic-minded citizens is begin to address the police unions, the police officers, our local community leaders, grassroots, as well as elected leaders, to put pressure, right, to bring officers who violate the rights of, remember, these are folks who are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. That's what I was brought up to know in the classroom. But what we saw in the streets was something different. Put pressure to make sure that these police officers are not only reprimanded, meaning they have been suspended with pay or reassigned. If murder is guilty for me and you, then murder is also unconstitutional and should come with jail time for these officers as well.
Thank you, Keith. We are now at 12:31, so our time together has ended. And I thank all the attendees for participating in the panel. I thank the sign language interpreters for joining us. And of course, our panelists, Dr. Keith Claybrook, Dr. Sharon, and Del Lendrum. I think this panel was a fantastic way to get our series of events started, and I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you.